Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, episode 97, Vendée Extermination. From mass drownings to hell columns, this episode will not be easy listening. It is time to end the civil war in the West, and the victors will not be merciful. But before we get into it, Grey History only survives the tumult of the modern world thanks to listener support. If you're enjoying the show, please help keep it on the air and indulge in ad-free listening and a range of other perks. In fact, there's three episode extras for this episode alone. Support the show today at patreon.com, and if you grab your phone now, you may well be done before the intro music finishes. Of course, it's with great pleasure that I get to welcome the newest virtuous citizens, Bruce, Christine, Coogans, Cyrus, Dave, Eleanor, Frosty Mac, G, Jeffrey, Jesse, John, Mandy, Peter, Rory, Sergey, C, and Cooper. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, Ari and William, and a big thank you to Shane for increasing his support and becoming a true revolutionary. Revolutions also need their champions, and so a tremendous welcome to the fabulous Alvaro as a champion of the people. Finally, a huge thank you to the great of the greats, the pantheon of heroes, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, and Kevin S. In mid-December 1793, the Catholic and Royal Army was crushed. Routed at Le Mans and then broken at Savernay, the Vendéan rebels were now slaughtered or scattered. Yet, as tens of thousands lay dead and thousands more were captured, the utter obliteration of the rebellion was not the harbinger of peace. Instead, with the Vendée the epitome of counter-revolution, blood continued to flow. For 10 months, the convention had defined the Vendée as the embodiment of pure evil. The region was the heart of a grand and international conspiracy which endangered the happiness and liberties of the French. Consequently, the defeat of the Grande Armée in December 1793 was merely the first of many steps. Only with the Vendée's complete extermination could peace and prosperity be restored. Thus, as major military engagements were soon relegated to the past, the violence in Western France continued unabated. Battles such as Le Mans and Savernay were followed by horrific massacres, and survivors were hunted down with glee. As commanders like Westermann refused to take prisoners, the Blues were encouraged to partake in horrendous bloodshed. So too was the local peasantry. Told by representatives on mission to rise up against the brigands, nearby inhabitants eagerly joined the carnage. With the rebels unable to recross the Loire, the resulting dead were not just soldiers, but often non-combatants. Lest you think these civilians were spared, take this account from one Republican commissioner who unapologetically reported the slaughter. I have never seen carnage like this. The road is littered with their corpses. Everything has been riddled with artillery, rifles, and bladed weapons. Women, priests, monks, men, and children all have been delivered to death. I have spared no one. I have also done my duty. There is pleasure in avenging one's country. The death toll from these butcheries is hard to ascertain. Collectively, it's likely that more than 10,000 Vendéans were killed in a little over a week. But, as we saw with the Federalist revolts, the ferocity of initial reprisals often gave way to more structured methodology. Be it in Lyon, Marseille, or Toulon, outbursts of revenge were replaced by tribunals and commissions. The same occurred in the Vendée. Given the region's vast expanse, numerous institutions were required. At times, multiple courts existed in just a single city, while others were established throughout the conflict zone. The resulting patchwork of judicial institutions made for inconsistent justice. Nonetheless, ruthlessness was a common trait. As discussed in prior episodes, a key response to the Vendée's initial eruption was the Law of 19 March. This decree made an outlaw of anyone engaged in armed rebellion. These individuals, now literally outside the law, were thus deprived of the benefits of a regular criminal trial. Denied both witnesses and lawyers, suspected rebels were brought before military commissions. These commissions would then promptly confirm the suspect's treason and immediate execution. By December 1793, this law had already been used to regularly execute captured insurgents. In fact, it also underpinned the elimination of so many Federalist rebels who had likewise engaged in open insurrection. But, with the Vendéan army annihilated, thousands of prisoners were soon detained by the Republic at the end of 1793. The result was a rapid rise in the number of death sentences, as various courts condemned the guilty. Take, for example, the situation in Nantes, where the so-called Bignon Commission was established to ensure uncompromising justice. Backed by representatives on mission, this commission initially followed the victorious Republican armies in Brittany before permanently residing in Nantes. In just 2 months, this one institution had pronounced at least 2,600 executions. Condemning an average of 50 people a day, the commission worked overtime to exterminate the rebels. Indeed, historian Jean-Clément Martin claims that the body was judging up to 200 people a day during its initial operations. Yet the so-called Bignon Commission was just one court. In Nantes alone, there was another commission, along with a separate revolutionary tribunal. The result was at least 3,000 people were executed in Nantes in just a matter of months. For comparison, after the Federalist Revolt of Marseille, only about 500 were condemned. In Toulon, that figure was closer to 1,000, while Lyon endured almost 2,000 executions, a few hundred of which were by cannon. Tallied up, the executions in Nantes were comparable to the combined total of Lyon, Marseille, and Toulon. This is absolutely astonishing, and to reiterate, this is merely Nantes. Similar commissions and courts were operating across the Vendée. Upriver, near Angers, another 3,000 were condemned, likely more. Additionally, similar scenes occurred across the region, in towns both big and small. Throughout 1793 and 94, numerous communities executed dozens or even hundreds of outlaws. But all these executions presented logistical hurdles. In fact, you may recall that part of the reason why the revolutionaries of Lyon had embraced cannons for their firing squads was practical limitations. With hundreds to condemn each week, guillotines were simply unsuitable for the task. The result was a tendency to embrace firing squads, and convicted prisoners were generally shot in the Vendée. However, this methodology had its own complications. For example, disease soon became a real threat to the victors, especially in Nantes. With each day providing dozens of additional corpses, gravediggers simply couldn't keep up. The air soon stank of half-buried corpses, and dogs wandered the streets holding chunks of human remains. However, while the authorities embraced the necessity of these mass executions, the prison population continued to grow. The Vendéan army had collapsed in just a matter of weeks. Having crossed the Loire in mid-October, the defeats at Le Mans and Savonay had occurred by 23 December. Consequently, prisoners of war flooded into jails at a far greater pace than executions could be conducted. Unable to properly contain these insurgents, available buildings were transformed into ad hoc prisons. Despite this, overcrowding remained an issue. In one jail, cells which had housed 4 criminals in April were now home to 14 prisoners less than a year later. In such circumstances, the prisons presented 2 considerable threats: disease and escape. Packed beyond capacity, the malnourished inmates rapidly spread infections. In just one coffee warehouse, which was used as a temporary prison, hundreds died of typhus and other excruciating diseases. Moreover, illness risked spreading from the cells to the streets, and thus the prisoners represented a danger to the broader population. Yet, even more alarming than plague and pestilence was the prospect of a jailbreak. As thousands languished in overcrowded prisons, rumours of plots and conspiracies haunted the local inhabitants. Just a year earlier, such talk had driven Parisians to commit the September massacres. Now, similar whispers could be heard. With the cells full of priests, nobles, and other good-for-nothing traitors, people spoke of grim solutions for the perils within the prisons. If the firing squads could not work fast enough, perhaps more drastic measures were required. But with these terrifying prisoners tormenting communities like Nantes, it is worth pausing the Vendée's extermination to examine this critical centre. Since the Battle of Nantes in June 1793, the Great Western Port had briefly flirted with joining the Federalist revolts. We discussed this in greater detail in the recent episode extra 95.1, Generals and Guillotines, but the result was an aborted attempt to rebel against Paris. Consequently, by December 1793, local radicals reigned supreme. Moderates like Mayor Barcot had been removed from power, while the local Jacobin representatives on mission supported a broader purge of all Girondin sympathisers. Of the various deputies stationed within the city, one name dominates the gruesome events which follow. Prior to the Revolution, Jean-Baptiste Carrier was an unremarkable lawyer. Although now one of the most infamous deputies, until late 1793, his revolutionary career was equally mundane. A firm Jacobin and a member of the radical Cordelet Club, Carrier had acted as a representative on mission in several departments before his assignment to Nantes. Arriving in the West at a time of continued Republican setbacks, Carrier was determined to secure the revolution through any means necessary. Embracing extraordinary measures to eliminate the enemy, it wasn't just royalists he pursued. Working in league with the local radicals, many of Nantes' elites were silenced or detained. Harsh measures were also introduced to enforce strict price controls, while supplies were secured for the nearby army of the West. Hunting Girondins as vigorously as royalists, Carrier was aided by a mixture of revolutionary groups. Of these, the most famous is a contingent of a few dozen sans-culottes, who formed a makeshift revolutionary army known as the Marat Company. These individuals had the right to carry out searches and arrests without a warrant, and engaged in a range of police duties in Nantes and beyond. Alongside these ultra-radical militants was a more unusual army unit called the American Hussars. Interestingly, this group was primarily comprised of black and mixed-race soldiers from the Caribbean, some of whom had been former slaves. Whites from the Americas also joined the unit, as did local whites who had been born within France. Indeed, their infamous leader, Jean Pinard, was a white citizen born in the Vendée. Critically, This unit of perhaps 200 men was responsible for much of the firing squads in Nantes. Furthermore, they also raided the surrounding country. There, they earned a reputation for extreme violence, most notably sexual violence. Although the unit remains under-researched, their atrocities against Vendéan women are regular fixtures of the conflict's histories. Pinard will be later executed for these crimes in the aftermath of the Terror. Finally, there was a third group of mounted scouts, along with a spy network which Carrier oversaw. Taken all together, it may sound that Carrier had at his disposal a sort of private army. But things are not that simple. To be clear, these groups were often rivals and beset by internal tensions. We've seen previously in Paris how Montagnard deputies worked alongside ultra-radicals not because they really wanted to, but because it was a political necessity. Furthermore, we've also seen how revolutionary societies were experts at splintering along a variety of fault lines. Now, while Carrier was certainly more radical than the average Jacobin, it's unclear the extent and limitations of his individual authority. For example, at one point Carrier was forced to close down the local political society despite the fact that it was the home of the city's sans-culottes and supplying many members of the Marat Company. So it is possible that those technically subordinate to the representatives on mission were at times acting independently. As historian Gaston Martin notes, these units contained more crazy people than brave patriots, wretches who had monetized their Jacobinism and made a business of public safety. Nonetheless, so long as they worked together, Carrier and the ultra-radicals of Nantes could control the city. However, this coordination, or lack thereof, obscures what happens next. With Carrier's eventual trial being one of the most important moments after the fall of Robespierre, everything I'm about to say is distorted by an atmosphere of blame-shifting and scapegoating. But what we do know is this. In November 1793, some Nantes radicals decided it was time to solve the problem of the prisons. Critically, this was in mid-November, a whole month before the final annihilation of the Vendéan army at Le Mans and Savonay. Already, the prisons were overcrowded, and it was normal for authorities to use ships as makeshift jails. As such, galleys had housed refractory priests for months. To be clear, these clerics were not rebels, but rather suspects who defied the revolution by refusing to swear the oath required under the civil constitution of the clergy. Now, on the evening of the 16th of November, 1793, a group of about 90 priests was transferred from a galley to a barge. Acting under the cover of darkness, this barge was then floated into the middle of the Loire River and sunk. Members of the Marat Company had deliberately drowned almost 100 people. Whether Carrier had explicitly ordered this drowning is a matter of historical debate. What is clear is that he actively encouraged future drownings, with more occurring throughout December and January. With speed, these mass drownings were conducted in an almost systematic manner. Prisoners were transferred to purpose-built barges which had holes cut into the sides of the boat. Chained together and locked inside, the boats would then be flooded and the occupants would drown. Originally occurring at night, these horrific executions eventually occurred in broad daylight. Perhaps it was decided that discretion was unnecessary when hundreds of corpses were washing up downriver. From November 1793 until February 1794, perhaps as many as 5,000 people were executed by drowning. The exact total is impossible to know, and while some witnesses would later allege that there were 23 boats, some scholars put the figure at less than 10. Nonetheless, Even the most minimal estimates place the toll of these drownings at roughly 2,000 people. Moreover, these actions were replicated elsewhere, with thousands drowned along the Loire. Officially, the justification for these horrific crimes was the danger posed by the prisoners. Be it pestilence or plots, the traitors within were a threat that simply had to be eliminated. At his trial in late 1794, one assailant reminded his Parisian jurors of the actions that they had undertaken in 1792. If the September massacres were justified as the Prussians marched on Paris, then why not the drownings of Nantes when the enemy was everywhere? All the measures, however extreme they may seem, were inevitable. Parisians, if you judged the day of September 2nd to be necessary, our position was perhaps even more delicate than yours. These drownings, however revolting they may seem to you, were no less indispensable than the massacre of September 2nd, in which you committed yourselves. Of course, posterity tends to view these murders with much the same revulsion as the mass killings by cannons in Lyon. And, to be clear, I use the word murders deliberately. While the drownings would later claim many Vendéan outlaws, the original victims were refractory priests. These clerics had not taken up arms against the Republic and deserved their day in court. Consequently, these nighttime executions were thoroughly illegal. No ifs, no buts. Moreover, later drownings included non-combatants, including Vendéan women and children, as the great rebel host disintegrated in December 1793. It's here that we get the so-called Republican marriages that would see men and women bound together as they sunk to the bottom of the river. Unlike the mass graves discovered in Le Mans, the proportion of civilian victims cannot be confirmed. That said, we do know a sizable portion were women, thanks to accounts of naked corpses washing up on shore. To be clear, these women were naked not because of sexual assault, but rather because the radicals started to rob the victims of their valuables before they chained them to the barges. This was quite profitable for the perpetrators, as in an era before electronic bank accounts, prisoners often held hidden valuables for safekeeping. Now, the mass drownings of 2,000 to 5,000 people naturally raise questions. One is the responsibility of Representative Carrier, and another is what the Convention and the Committee of Public Safety knew of these murders. As it relates to the former, it's simply not known if Representative Carrier was the driving force behind the initial mass drownings. I suspect he knew, but it's not clear whether it was his idea or whether he felt compelled to support the wishes of local ultra-radicals who constituted his power base. However, if I had to guess, I would say it was his proposal, or at least an idea he eagerly adopted. To justify this, I would point to his earlier cryptic writings to the Committee of Public Safety. Carrier had written in September how cargoes of priests could be transferred to a mariner known for their patriotism. In light of subsequent events, the creation of cargoes of priests for a patriotic mariner seems rather ominous. Of course, after the initial drownings, Carrier does become an undeniable supporter. They would not have continued without his blessing, and he later instigated the drownings of captured rebels. Moreover, he publicly defended and championed these actions. Now, this may seem disgusting, boasting of chaining naked people in boats for the explicit purpose of having them drowned. But details were deliberately kept vague in communications to Paris, and the convention had declared its desire to exterminate the Vendée. Furthermore, other representatives bragged about their own harsh repressions of the Federalist rebellions. In fact, it was moderation, not extremism that contemporaries often saw as the greater crime. Yet, just like Lyon's mass executions by cannons, these boasts and cryptic comments opens up a thornier question. What did the convention and its Committee of Public Safety know of these events? And by association, how responsible are they for encouraging, or at least enabling, these mass drownings? That is one river-sized conundrum, and I don't want to spend the rest of this episode unpacking that contentious debate. Put simply, while Paris knew of drownings, Carrier's reports were deliberately vague. As such, historians have long disputed exactly who knew what when, and thus who shares responsibility. So, this mystery will be the topic of the first episode extra for this episode. The second of 3 episode extras will focus on an unintended byproduct of so much death: orphans. With thousands of children left destitute by war and massacre, how did the Republic respond? From rescue to re-education to some grim stories of child labour, this episode extra unpacks the unique experiences of Vendée's youngest survivors. Now, with these horrific drownings, I know what you must be thinking. Surely this couldn't get any worse. Well, this is the French Revolution, and extremities are its speciality. With guillotines, firing squads, and mass drownings working overtime, the French Republic had an even bigger problem than captured rebels. What now with the Vendée itself? For 9 months, the region had been the linchpin of a great international conspiracy. The most menacing threat to the Republic, it had become, at least rhetorically, public enemy number 1. With Western France infected with the cancer of counter-revolution, the defeat of the main Catholic and Royal Army was just the initial remedy. More had to be done to purge this vile plague. Firstly, the remnants of Charette's Army of the Marsh were still loose in western Vendée. Along with a few lucky survivors of the main Catholic and Royal Army, including its leader La Rochefoucauld, there were rebel columns to pursue. But even Charette's force now numbered just a few thousand. From a pure military perspective, the Vendée was largely crushed. However, perception can be more important than reality, and from the perspective of Paris, the Vendée remained a threat. For almost a year, the region had been the epicenter of counter-revolution. The inhabitants had fed, sheltered, and enabled this greatest of foes. And so, the region remained an existential danger. Sure, the rebel armies were beaten, but what of the underlying cause? Nobles would continue to plot. Men could be tempted by fanatics. Women may raise future brigands, while émigrés and foreigners no doubt waited for their chance to strike. Thus, with outlaws on the run and potential rebels abundant, the revolutionaries had a conundrum: how to pacify the Vendée. As with handling the Federalist revolts, ideas ranged from the moderate to the extreme. Some, like General Kleber, proposed a rather orthodox approach. Kleber suggested that the Vendée be secured by stationing strongholds throughout the region. Essentially, Western France would be permanently occupied, and any unrest could be quickly smothered. Given the fact that the Civil War had started because of insufficient troops to quell simple recruitment riots, this was an entirely sensible approach. Moreover, Kleber firmly believed that the locals wanted peace. Indeed, such sentiments can be found amongst the memoirs of the rebels themselves. But traditional military men, like Kleber, were not currently in charge, nor were moderates. After the disastrous leadership of the fencing master Lechelle, the Army of the West was eventually transferred to Louis-Marie Turreau. Another sans-culotte general, Turreau had risen through the ranks of the volunteer battalions and had ties to the ultra-radicals. But, in a rather pleasant surprise, Turreau did have some genuine talent, including in military affairs. However, while in this he differed from his militant predecessors, one point of continuity remained: his enthusiasm for total war. Surveying the Vendée at the start of 1794, Turreau would bring fire and fury. Taking literally the convention's decrees to exterminate the Vendée, Turreau would attempt to pacify the region through force. Ignoring Kleber's more sober proposal, Turreau instead created the Infernal Columns. Totaling some 30,000 troops, 12 columns would sweep across the Vendée. Their orders were to burn everything. Suspecting those who remained as either rebels or royalists, the troops were let loose. Explicitly ordered to use all means necessary to find and bayonet the brigands, Turreau encouraged them to set fire to villages, farms, woods, and anything else that burnt. Detailing his plan to the Committee of Public Safety, the general asked for specific instructions on the fate of the region's women and children. Demonstrating the ruthlessness of this plan, Turreau simply asked if they must all be killed. A decree was issued, absolving him of responsibility. That decree would not be forthcoming, but Lazare Carnot later wrote that his proposal seemed good and pure. Notably, Carnot stated that the committee awaited results before pronouncing a final judgment, and reiterated the committee's desire to exterminate the brigands to the last. Consequently, for some scholars, that assurance helps to incriminate the fabled organizer of victory in the slaughter which soon followed. With the hell columns commencing mid-January, by the 31st, Turreau boasted of his achievements to Paris. Captured rebels had been bayoneted, and further repression was to follow. Yet, far from reining in Turreau's campaign of terror, the convention proceeded to fuel it. In August 1793, it had decreed the extermination of the Vendée, words which had often been repeated. Now, in early February 1794, the body once more declared the necessity of its complete and utter destruction. In fact, it not only called for the enemy to be pursued relentlessly, but it threatened to denounce any general who failed to embrace these measures. Thus, the convention was using similar rhetoric to that of Barrère back in August, when he demanded the extermination of the rebellious race. However, in an interesting twist, the body also recalled Representative Carrier from Nantes. Tensions with both local revolutionaries and agents of the Committee of Public Safety had terminated his mission in the West. But Carrier's replacements were no less brutal. 2 weeks later, on the 20th of February, the new representatives on mission decreed that all refugees must settle 6 leagues from the Vendée. Any who remained inside would be suspected of rebellion. Ordered to destroy the insurgency in its entirety, the scenes which followed were horrendous. For months, the most egregious crimes were committed by Republican forces determined to exterminate their foe. Rape, theft, and pillaging accompanied arson and bloodshed, and proponents of the Vendéan cause have no shortage of examples in which to dishonour the conduct of the Blues. One famous example is the massacre of Lux across February and March 1794. In traditional accounts, Republican troops slaughtered more than 500 people over just 2 days. Critically, hundreds of non-combatants were murdered, with some records indicating at least 100 children amongst the dead. But, in the specific instance of the massacres of Lux, a lack of firm evidence obscures precisely what occurred. Some scholars argue that the figure of more than 500 includes all the inhabitants who were killed throughout the entirety of the war. It also potentially includes residents from nearby communities, further inflating the figure. However, other scholars firmly disagree, reaffirming the likely accuracy of a single mass slaughter. Put simply, the only clear truth is that at Luke's and elsewhere, identifying the total dead is utterly impossible. Nonetheless, whatever occurred in the town and its surrounds, it is clear that hundreds of innocent civilians, including children, were killed by Republican troops. Moreover, these were far from isolated scenes, with similar stories occurring across the Vendée. As an aside, the commune of Le Luxe-Boulogne has become a key location for memorializing the victims of the war. Consequently, there are some striking stained glass windows remembering these events, and I've included images on the website, Instagram, and Patreon. I've also included sketches of the infernal columns and the mass drownings, as well as portraits of key players. Links can be found in the show notes, and I recommend you check out these visual depictions of the conflict. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, these hell columns didn't pacify the region so much as re-inflame it. Charette and the other rebel leaders soon saw their ranks swell as the Blues' horrendous crimes spurred inhabitants to join the royalist cause. This is to be expected given these barbaric atrocities, but the growing strength of the enemy merely inclined General Turreau to adopt even harsher tactics. Unlike the initially secretive mass drownings of Nantes, written orders remain from what was an official military campaign. Thus, we can see the growing frustration of Republican leaders and an increasing willingness to embrace the convention's demand for extermination. Likewise, an abundance of first-hand accounts were written by soldiers on the ground, detailing the horrors of the Vendée. In the following letter, one Republican official described the Republic's ruthless methodology. Destroy the watermills, burn the windmills, smash the ovens. Depend on the humanity of the cavalry each day to gather up those children who can be given a Republican education. Send them out to follow the grain convoys, the livestock. Put everyone else to the sword. Both sexes, young and old. I have become cruel. The pain that this cursed war has made me suffer forced me to do so. Another Republican, a captain in the Liberty Battalion, wrote similar details in a letter to his sister. Down dreadful roads, our soldiers cross the drear deserts of the Vendée. Everywhere we go, we bring fire and death. Neither age, nor sex, nor anything else is respected. Yesterday, one of our detachments burned a village. A volunteer killed 3 women with his bare hands. It is horrible, but the safety of the Republic urgently requires it. What a war! Every person we see, we shoot. Everywhere the earth is littered with corpses. Everywhere flames have brought their devastation. With the military determined to eradicate the rebellion, not even loyal Republicans were safe. In one town, 59 people were killed by government troops, including elected municipal officials and constitutional clergy. Elsewhere, reports from soldiers and accounts from survivors detail even grimmer atrocities. Of course, identifying truth, embellishment, and outright propaganda is impossible. Many of the tales repeated today have varying degrees of evidence, at times barely any, or none at all. But what is absolutely clear is that Turreau's hell columns deserved the name. The death toll reflects as such. From January to July 1794, between 20 to 50,000 people died in the Vendée. I'll say that again, 20 to 50,000. This was horrendous bloodshed on a scale uncomparable to anything else in the Revolutionary era. Despite this, contemporaries would later defend their actions with the age-old excuse. We were just following orders. Others were even less apologetic and noted their sincere belief in doing what must be done. We were all feverish. We believed that, when you act for the people, nothing can be wrong, error, or crime. Irrelevant of one's feverish beliefs, crimes were abundant. Murder, rape, theft, pillaging, the accounts are both detailed and numerous. But there is one crime in particular that continues to divide the modern French Republic. That is the crime of genocide. In 1986, a young French historian named Renaud Sachet published a book which fundamentally reshaped the study of the Vendée. In it, Sachet argued that the events of the Civil War constitute a French genocide. After all, the National Convention had demanded the extermination of the Vendéan race, and its officials had boasted of purifying the region with cannon and fire. Given this exterminationist rhetoric, along with the systematic murder of men, women, and children, Sachet sees a genocide in the Republic's explicit attempts to destroy the Vendée. But in order to understand why Sachet's findings have been largely rejected by the academic community, it's easiest to start with the research of his detractors. From there, we can work backwards towards Sachet's original assertions to better understand this debate. Yet, before we begin, it is worth noting from the outset the impact that Sachet has had on the study of the Vendée. When Sachet published his book, titled A French Genocide, in 1986, the result was an academic firestorm. Prior to his work, the Vendée was often overlooked by leading historians. That omission was starting to be rectified, but many of the great scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries had largely glossed over key components of the struggle. However, since Sachet's accusations, the Vendée has experienced a tremendous surge in prominence. Academics have spent enormous resources trying to understand what precisely happened in the West. Consequently, even if one rejects Sachet's findings, one cannot underestimate the impact of his work on the historiography of both the Civil War and the wider Revolution. Moreover, even some of his most fierce detractors will acknowledge that it was right to ask the question if a genocide had occurred. Now, since the 1980s, the vast majority of the academic community has roundly rejected Sachet's findings. One of the most high-profile scholars to do this is historian Jean-Clément Martin. Martin was one of the first to dissect Sachet's claims, and paradoxically, he concluded that the total death toll was actually higher than Sachet's initial estimates. Whereas Sachet put the figure at some 117,000, Martin placed it closer to 200,000. But Martin also denied the occurrence of a genocide, and since attacked Sachet's work for its methodology and sensationalism. To comprehend why Martin could simultaneously increase the death toll yet refute claims of genocide, we need to familiarize ourselves with the definition of the crime. The word itself is a mixture of both Greek and Latin. Geno is derived from Greek, meaning race, tribe, or kind, and cide derives from the Latin for killing. The term was first coined in the 1940s by the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin. Lemkin created the word in direct response to the Nazis' treatment of European Jews during World War II, and he subsequently campaigned for the criminalization of genocide in the following years. Shortly thereafter, the new United Nations enshrined these efforts in the Genocide Convention of 1948. In it, genocide was formally defined, although with a much narrower definition than Lemkin had hoped. Henceforth, the treaty defined genocide as any of 5 acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Those 5 acts against these protected groups included killing members, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, as it relates to the Vendée, the most important part of that definition is the start. Acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Notably, political groups, such as rebels against a regime, are missing from that definition. And in the West, the Vendéans were fundamentally a political group. As discussed previously, prior to the Revolution, the Vendée did not exist. The Vendée was not an ancient province with a unique history, culture, or people. Consequently, Vendéans did not exist. They were not a unique national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. They were French. No more, no less. As such, for many scholars, it is impossible for the atrocities in the Vendée to be a genocide because the Vendéans were not members of one of the groups protected by the Genocide Convention of 1948. Yes, there was horrendous violence, and for some, it does amount to crimes against humanity. But on the specific crime of genocide, those opposed to Sachet's findings argue that genocide is simply not possible, as the victims were not a protected minority as defined by the Genocide Convention. Moreover, the Convention not only specifies which groups are protected, but it also explicitly states that there must be an intent to destroy that group. Here too, some scholars take issue with the term genocide. For all the rhetoric of exterminating the Vendéan race, the Republic's actions could differ considerably. For example, the National Convention actively assigned funds to assist the resettlement of refugees from the Vendée. Likewise, orders were given to safeguard young children from the violence and ensure a proper education and upbringing. Funds for refugees and the sheltering of children is not usually what you would expect from a genocidal regime. Moreover, even in August 1793, when Barrère called for the extermination of this rebellious race, he simultaneously called for women, children, and the elderly to be treated with respect. Additionally, historian Peter McPhee notes that the convention considered proposals that envisioned a punitive redistribution of property from rebel families to those of local patriots. For McPhee, this proposed transfer of property between neighbours underscores what he calls an inescapable conclusion that this was a particularly brutal civil war, not a genocide. Lastly, when looking at the matter of intent, it's not just the convention's contradictory decrees which subvert its exterminationist rhetoric. While some Republican officers were brutal in literally enforcing orders to destroy the Vendée, many were not. Some generals actively refused these immoral commands, while others proposed alternative strategies. Indeed, Kleber's original plan was simply to garrison the Vendée with strongholds, a suggestion supported by others and indicative that perhaps extermination was not truly the government's intent. Moreover, in the much publicized quotes of General Westermann, who bragged about massacring Vendéans, the general explicitly states that it's the absence of other officers, like Kleber, which allows for the slaughter to occur. At a time when the government was guillotining unreliable officers, would Kleber and others really have prevented these executions had they thought it was the genuine will of the government? And does the divergent actions of military officers not demonstrate the lack of a common intent, along with the consistent dysfunction which defined the Republic's armies in the West. Additionally, local authorities actively prosecuted officers that they felt had committed crimes. For example, the authorities in Luzon had one officer tried and executed for theft, rape, and murder. Astonishingly, they then proceeded to pursue his superiors, while the surveillance committee from another town denounced soldiers and generals in a dossier sent to Paris. Some were subsequently brought to trial. Put simply, these inconsistent and contradictory actions by Republican officials, both civilian and military, casts doubt on a genuine intent by the regime to actually exterminate the Vendée. If such an intent existed, why were military officers and local courts obstructing the alleged will of the national government? And why was the army considering different proposals for pacification which were not exterminationist in nature? However, before we move on, we should note that the language of the Republican government does at times appear genocidal. Such is the nature of calls to exterminate this rebellious race. But when the convention decreed the extermination of the Vendéan race, the word Vendée was essentially a byword for counter-revolution. Remember, there was no Vendéan race. The Department of Vendée did not exist until 1790, and the broader region of the Vendée did not exist until 1793, and never would have existed had government troops managed to contain recruitment riots in March of that year. Instead, as the Vendée emerged as the epitome of counter-revolution, Vendéans became a catch-all word for rebels, brigands, royalists, federalists, guerrilla fighters, insurrectionists, and all other counter-revolutionaries. It's for this reason that the government talks of Vendéans well outside Western France. Furthermore, in the future, French officials will identify the colonial Vendée of Haiti. Obviously, Haiti was not literally a colony of Vendéans. It wasn't even a stronghold for royalism or religion. The colonial Vendée was another insurrection against Paris, defined by guerrilla warfare which needed to be ruthlessly crushed. In 1793, cries to exterminate the Vendée were cries to exterminate rebellion. The Vendéans were never some clearly defined minority, but an abstract label for all who endangered the Republic. Moreover, because the government was unable to effectively neutralize this threat until late 1793, politicians reached for increasingly violent rhetoric. The inability to suppress the unrest encouraged extreme exaggeration, decrees which were never meant to literally exterminate Western France. Yes, some ultra-radical commanders took this as a license to be particularly brutal, but many others did not. So, for scholars like Jean-Clément Martin and Peter McPhee, there was no genocide in the West. The Vendéans were not a clearly defined group, and they certainly weren't a protected national, ethnic, racial, or religious minority under the Genocide Convention of 1948. Additionally, some scholars would contest any intention to eliminate this group, as local populations considered loyal were actively aided by the Republic. Instead, it was the rebels which the government wished to eliminate, not every inhabitant of the Vendée. Notably, this view is supported by the fact that some communities were left completely untouched by Turreau's infernal columns, while neighbouring villages may have suffered repeated attacks. For scholars like Martin, this is the opposite of any systematic scheme to exterminate, but rather further evidence of random and violent outbursts from a divided military. Finally, some historians note that the level of violence seen in Western France did not differ wildly from similar conflicts of the era. This perspective is certainly not held universally, but several point to comparable counterinsurgency actions taken in Spain, Ireland, Italy, and the Caribbean. But, having heard the case against a French genocide, it's here that we should return to Sachet's initial work. If the Genocide Convention of 1948 is not applicable to the Vendée because it does not protect political groups, then what definition did Sachet use for his groundbreaking publication in 1986? Well, it's here that we hit an immediate problem. One of the biggest criticisms of Sachet's work is the fact that Sachet does not offer a serious definition for the crime. Instead, the closest he gets is just a single sentence, which states that it is the desire to remove any trace of a rebel people from the surface of the earth which defines genocide. Now, not only are rebel people not covered by the UN Convention of 1948, but this is just a single sentence, and it's in the conclusion of the book. This despite the fact that his work is titled The French Genocide. Furthermore, in addition to this sensationalist title, and rather sensationalist definition, the word genocide appears only a handful of times throughout the entire text. Surely a book so provocatively titled as The French Genocide should actively define and then justify this stance. This striking omission is part of the reason why the mainstream academic community is so hostile towards Sachet's work. There are other well-grounded reasons, like historian Howard Brown's observation that Sachet's own research places the greatest toll of devastation in locations with little correlation to those impacted by Thoreau's hell columns. This would in turn suggest that numerous fatalities arose from the Civil War itself and not the violent repression afterwards. However, if we avoid the weeds of various academic criticisms around sources and methodology, the lack of a clear definition for genocide offers a simple but powerful example of both the book's shortcomings and its criticisms. Put simply, many scholars see Sachet's publication not as a good faith pursuit of the truth, but as a way to sensationalize the past for modern political purposes. Indeed, they see it as an effort by the French right to discredit the French left by highlighting the atrocities of the Revolution. Perhaps this isn't surprising when one looks at Sachet's professor. You see, Sachet was the student of historian Pierre Chanou, who unapologetically linked the Revolution to the totalitarianism of the 20th century. For Chanou, a member of the French far right, the Jacobins were, and I quote, the first act, the founding event of a long and bloody series which goes from 1792 to the present day, from the French genocide of the Catholic West to the Soviet Gulag to the destructions of the Chinese Cultural Revolution and the Khmer Rouge auto-genocide in Cambodia. So, with a professor who literally described the revolution as an ideological cancer, it's perhaps not surprising that Sachet's findings were critical of the revolution. But it's not Sachet's criticisms which have rendered him an academic outcast. Many conservative and right-wing historians are celebrated for their contribution to the field. Instead, it's due to the view that Sachet's work is neither objective nor impartial. It's seen as a deliberate attempt to advance a political agenda using methods and sources which predetermined the conclusion. To varying degrees, this view is shared by many, even those who compliment Sachet for some of his positive impact on the historiography of the Vendée. Now, one particularly sharp criticism of Sachet's work can be found by historian David Bell. Remember, back in episode 92, Dr. Bell held nothing back as he accused Sachet of seeking to use the term genocide for modern political purposes. More specifically, he alleged that Sachet and others were trying to distract from the French right's assistance in the Holocaust by highlighting the actions of the French left in the supposed genocide in the Vendée. This accusation is not new and was common back in the 1980s when Sachet first released his work. Nonetheless, given the far-right links of men like Sachet's professor Chenu, this is another element which fuels suspicions, if not outright hostility, towards Sachet's research. Dr. Bell states,
And I think we should also be honest about the motivations of the right-wing historians who use the concept of the Vendée, use the concept of genocide and apply it to the Vendée. The word was first used by Reynald Secher in his book of 1986 called Le Génocide franco-français, la Vendée vengée. Secher was a man from the extreme right. He was writing this book at precisely the moment, and it is no coincidence, precisely the moment when the French were beginning to confront in an honest way the role of the French state under Vichy and the role of the French population in actually actively aiding the Germans in the Holocaust and the Shoah of the Second World War. And it was precisely at this moment that Secher and many people on the right, really started using the word genocide in part so that they could say, look, if there's a genocide in French history, which the French are guilty of, it's not the genocide of the Jews in World War II. It is actually the genocide of the Vendéans by the revolution and by the left, therefore, in 1793-94. And now this has developed into quite a cottage industry in the United States. You can see videos that circulate among ultra-right Catholic circles, which say this wasn't simply an attempt to commit genocide against the Vendée, it was an attempt to commit genocide against Catholics, which takes it obviously one very, very large step further, given that 99% of the French population at the time was Catholic. What were they going to do? Kill themselves entirely? So I do think that the use of the concept of genocide here is misguided and has a fairly sinister motivation behind it as well.
Following the publication of his original work in 1986, Sachet did attempt to address much of this criticism face-on. In a book titled Jews and Vendéans, From One Genocide to Another, Sachet made it clear that he did not intend to trivialize or relativize the Holocaust. But in moves that would further infuriate his detractors, Sachet went on to directly link the experiences of Jews and Vendéans. Regretting that France had forgotten these horrendous crimes, Sachet denounced the fact that the nation had made the executioners secular saints. He also warned that the denial of the Vendéan genocide could soon lead to the denial of the Jewish Holocaust. Describing events in the Vendée as a Holocaust as well, Sachet provocatively claimed, "The Convention and the Committee of Public Safety, by conceptualizing, voting for, and carrying out the extermination of its population and the destruction of its property, transgressed the fundamental laws of humanity in the same way as Hitler." Unsurprisingly, Sachet's comparison of the National Convention to Adolf Hitler wins him few friends amongst revolutionary scholars. Lines like this further fuel suspicions that Sachet is more interested in political point scoring than genuine academic research. Consequently, Sachet remains something of a pariah amongst modern scholars. However, in French politics, Sachet is often cited and celebrated by the political right. Indeed, Sachet is generally portrayed as a martyr by supporters, ostracized for speaking an unfortunate truth against the nation's foundational myths. Reflecting the ongoing struggle for the memory of both the Revolution and the Vendée, numerous bills have been introduced in the French legislature seeking to formally recognize these events as genocide. For now, these assertions remain unrecognized, both legally and by the majority of the academic community. As an aside, some individuals would like to portray these events as a genocide not only against Vendéans, but against French Catholics. Indeed, in Sachet's subsequent work, he argues that the Vendée massacres are covered by the UN Genocide Convention, as the Vendéans were a religious group. According to Sachet, the Vendéans were not targeted for their politics, but because of their Catholic faith. Consequently, they meet the requirements of a protected minority under the 1948 Convention. Now, the mass killings of Catholics with the intent to destroy that group would indeed be a genocide. However, most scholars would argue that such mass killings simply never occurred. After all, this was a republic which was at least 95% Catholic, likely more. How precisely did the regime intend to destroy the vast majority of the nation? And if this was their true intention, why was the rest of France left untouched? Civil war grouped numerous cities, and yet at no point did the authorities use this tremendous opportunity as a means to target and murder local Catholics at large scale. Catholics were never explicitly targeted, as Lyon, Marseille, and Toulon were reclaimed by the Republic, despite the obvious chance to do so in the wake of the Federalist revolts. Likewise, not even neighbouring Brittany, with its own guerrilla war of 1794, saw efforts to exterminate local Catholics. And Nantes, the scene of the Vendée's mass drownings, did not experience murderous purges of its own Catholic residents. If the Vendéans were being targeted because of their faith, then why were other French Catholics left untouched? And why did the government's rhetoric focus on royalism and rebellion rather than the Christian faith? Moreover, while the de-Christianization campaign of 1793 was terrible, only a minority of officials partook in these events. As we'll see in future episodes, the de-Christianization campaign is complicated, and it did not enjoy the full support of the national government. In fact, quite the opposite. This would bring into question any intent to destroy a protected religious group. But before we return to the Vendée in 1794, I do actually think there is a way to argue, in good faith, that a genocide might have occurred in the Vendée. So, we'll be exploring this in the third episode extra for this episode, as I unpack my journey and my thoughts while researching this controversial topic. Critically, when it comes to a potential genocide in the Vendée, I would note the role of the USSR and colonial powers in defining the Genocide Convention of 1948. That is incredibly consequential, so don't miss this and the other episode extras for this episode by supporting the show on Patreon today. Lastly, it's not often that the standard bearers of two polar opposite views are alive and well. So, in the spirit of grey history, I have invited both Reynald Sachet and Jean-Clément Martin to share their divergent perspectives on the genocide debate. Historian Jean-Clément Martin has accepted my offer, and so in the next episode we will hear directly from him on both the Vendée and the Terror. Given that Jean-Clément Martin is also a champion of what Jeremy Popkin labels the Don't Say Terror school, there will be plenty of grey to unpack. Now, taking a step back from the genocide debate, we should return to the Vendée in 1794. With the infernal columns killing perhaps as many as 50,000 people in the first half of the year, what precisely happened next? Well, the result was war. Instead of pacification, Turrot's held columns simply renewed rebellion. The Vendée continued to experience conflict, and worse, neighbouring regions like Brittany were experiencing their own outbreaks of insurrection. Consequently, Turrot's strategy was a disaster. Recalled by Paris in May 1794, the sans-culotte general was replaced by more talented commanders. Notably, the former General Conclus was eventually restored to prominence, while the capable General Hoche was also elevated upon his release after Thermidor. These more moderate commanders proceeded to implement a plan much closer to General Kleber's, garrisoning the region with strongholds and crushing rebel columns when they appeared. This proved to be somewhat successful, and it certainly prevented the insurrection from spreading further. As an aside, this opens up an interesting what-if. Had Kleber's plans been adopted in the first place, the infernal columns may never have happened. Civilian deaths would therefore have been dramatically less, and it's possible that there would be no genocide debate to be had. But as Kleber was ignored, it wasn't until the second half of 1794 that a less extreme attempt was made to pacify the region. General Hoche could pursue this policy, as by then Robespierre was dead, the Terror was over, and the convention was in a far more conciliatory mood. In February 1795, a peace treaty was even signed with some rebel leaders. Reflecting the variety of factors fueling the revolt, freedom of worship was established, but so too was exemption from both taxation and conscription. The ensuing peace would remain patchy for years to come, but the region never saw a resurgence in civil war on the same scale experienced in 1793. By mid-1796, hostilities were largely complete, as far as the Directory was concerned. So, that brings an end to our narrative episodes on the Vendée Civil War. In total, between 200 and 250,000 people were killed in this horrendous conflict. For reference, that represents more than a quarter of the region's pre-war population. Naturally, the Civil War in the West continues to divide opinions in the modern French Republic, and the debates surrounding the conflict will continue for years to come. But on a more immediate note, I welcome your questions on the struggle, as we will do a Vendée Q&A episode shortly. Next episode, we will hear from Dr. Jean-Clément Martin, one of the foremost experts on the Vendée and the Terror. After that, we will return to Paris to witness the rise of the Committee of Public Safety and the establishment of revolutionary government. From there, we will unpack the infamous de-Christianization campaign, the temples of reason, and the power struggles within the capital. As we approach 1794, I hope you're ready. Churches will crumble, factions will fall, and the revolution will devour its children. Thank you for listening to episode 97, Vendée Extermination. Don't miss the 3 episode extras for this episode. Firstly, there's my thoughts on the genocide debate, which includes a trip to Moscow in the Cold War. Secondly, here's what Paris knew of Nantes mass drownings. And finally, there's the unusual experiences of orphans from the Vendée. This and other exclusive bonus content is ready for you right now. So please, if you're enjoying Grey History, support the show today at patreon.com. You can cancel anytime, but for the price of just a coffee or 2 a month, you can help create independent history that isn't black and white. So grab your phone or open your laptop and support the show today. I look forward to welcoming you personally. As always, thank you for listening. Please support the show, stay safe, and have a great day. Grey History is brought to you by its amazing community members, including the heroes of the Revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, and Kevin S. Joining the amazing heroes are the fantastic champions of the people, Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Ritus, Cameron, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Susan, Danny, Gordon, Matthew, Sophia, Kevin, Scott, Jersey, and Alvaro.